Hello there, friends. It's Jimmy Maverick. Welcome to the Fantasy Maverick podcast. And on today's show, we're going to talk about 5 tips which are going to help you with your 2020 fantasy draft. So stay tuned for that. Here we go.
Listen up. It's time for the Fantasy Maverick podcast, starring the guy who's going to help you win that fantasy championship, Jimmy Maverick.
Hello there, friends, and welcome to the Fantasy Maverick podcast, coming at you from Santa Fe, New Mexico. My name is Jimmy Maverick, and today we are going to talk about 5 tips that are going to help you win your draft this fantasy season. I got some good stuff here. This is really going to help you out for the upcoming season, but before we begin with that, I want to talk about bye weeks for just a minute, because there just happens to be this year 2 teams that have a bye on week 13. And this, I think, is a big problem for fantasy, and it's 2 pretty big teams. It's Carolina Panthers and it's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Week 13 is probably one of the most critical weeks of the fantasy season. That is usually the very last week of the regular season, right? Before you go to the fantasy playoffs. So typically you are in a situation where you're jockeying for a position, or you are just desperately trying to make the playoffs. Like if you play in tournament leagues, like I play in the Fantasy Football Players Championship, the FFPC, their regular season is weeks 1 through 11, and then their playoffs are week 12 and 13. The championship is on week 13. And I just don't think there's any way that you can take players from these 2 teams with any confidence that because they're not going to be available for you on one of the most critical weeks of the year in both cases, right? I mean, you look at the names on these teams; these are big fantasy names. I mean, you've got. Let's hear who you got. You got Christian McCaffrey. You got Tom Brady, Chris Godwin, DJ Moore, Rob Gronkowski, Mike Evans, Curtis Samuel. You know, there's a huge long list of names here. And these are all guys that are pretty much going to be your 1 or your 2 on your team. So I just have to just express my concern about this. And really, like I said, man, I would very much try to steer clear of these 2 teams for fantasy this year because of this situation. Now, if you have a fantasy team where you go to week 14 and then the playoffs are week 15 and 16, I think you're okay. I think I would be comfortable with taking these guys. But man, for those of the rest of us that are in those leagues where more than 4 teams make the playoffs, I like I said, I just don't think it's a good idea to take these players. So that's my 2 cents. So be cautious with that and just be aware. So let's talk about tips for the upcoming fantasy football season, especially for your draft. And, you know, my first tip is this. It's don't chase last year's stats, okay? All too often with fantasy football, it's lazy analysis, right? They just copy and paste what happened last year onto this year's list. And you know, when you talk about players, especially the players that broke NFL records last season, I mean, I'm talking about Lamar Jackson, Michael Thomas, Christian McCaffrey, these big names. These guys are now going snatched up super early in the draft, and let me just say, man, it is extremely difficult for a player to match or exceed a records-breaking season. I mean, just by definition, it's a record-breaking season. Nobody's done it before, or maybe 1 or 2 people have done it before they have. But in 2018, man, you had players like Patrick Mahomes and Saquon Barkley and George Kittle and Travis Kelce. Those were 4 guys that broke NFL records. And how'd they do last year? Well, they were all disappointments. And what I found was that coming off of a record-breaking season, their per game production declined by anywhere from about 15 to 20% right off the bat. And then with the case with a lot of these guys this past year, they got hurt. They missed a few games. Again, it just annihilated their fantasy value. And with the premium that you have to pay to get these players this year, I mean, come on, CMC's number 1. Michael Thomas is probably number 3 or number 4. And Lamar Jackson is going in the first 2 rounds. I see massive regression risk on all these guys. And really, I would stay away from all of them this year. They're going to disappoint whoever takes them. It's just, they can't help it because they're coming off of a record-setting year. So that's my first tip, all right? Now, tip number 2. Oh, yes, rookie quarterbacks. Rookie quarterbacks, I don't ever draft, right? I mean, they're very, what's the word to say? Even if they do really good, it's not that great. What I see is with a rookie quarterback, they'll come in, they'll probably get maybe around 20 touchdowns, but they'll also get like just about as many interceptions, right? They'll be like the 15 to 17 interception range. And what that means is that not only is their value terrible, but they negatively impact the value of every other player on that team. I mean, if you're only throwing 20 touchdowns, it's going to be hard for those wide receivers to be worth their value in the upcoming season. If they turn the ball over a lot, that's killing drives, killing production. And so what I want to tell you, man, is that rookie quarterbacks, they ruin the value of everybody on their team for fantasy. And this year, this year you've got some big names, right? You got Joe Burrow in Cincinnati, you got Tua in Miami, and you've got Justin Herbert in Los Angeles. Again, I'm staying clear of all those teams for fantasy. For the most part, I mean, if I find a good bargain or if I find a late round guy that I like, there are options there. But, these guys are going to struggle. They're going to have to face NFL level speed, which they haven't faced before. And granted, last year, Kyler Murray put together an outstanding rookie season. I mean, he had like 26 touchdowns, I think only 10 interceptions. Really, he was excellent. That is more the exception than the rule. Like I said, these guys come out, you look at other players, Dwayne Haskins, Daniel Jones, Gardner Minshew. These guys had good games, right? They did put together some good games. They showed some stuff. I really like several of them for this year. Like Daniel Jones, I really like him. I'm thinking of taking him as my QB1. But last year is an adjustment year for them. They got to learn the system. They've got to get used to the players. They got to get used to NFL speed. And it's year 2 when they really start to come out and do very well. So that's my second tip. Second tip is that. Third tip this year, and I've been saying this in a lot of in a lot of my podcasts. I'm sure you're getting sick of it at this point, but man, wide receivers are deep as the ocean this year. Deep, deep, deep. You do not need to spend an early draft pick on an elite wide receiver because there's a couple of reasons, right? The first is the elite wide receivers were horrendous last year. If it wasn't Michael Thomas or Julio Jones, any of the other elite receivers that you took were garbage piles. Man, they were injured. They had terrible performances. They were just flat out busts. I mean, really, it was really a bad season. And because of that, that's going to reflect on this year's draft board. And what you're seeing is these elite wide receivers are going later than they normally would. And also this year, we're in a situation where I think there's a very good possibility that in most drafts, you're going to see 2 tight ends and 2 quarterbacks taken in the first 2 rounds. And so what that's going to do is that's going to push 4 wide receivers, 3 or 4 wide receivers into the 3rd round and later, right? So you will still be able to get a wide receiver 1 in the 3rd round. You can get yourself a wide receiver 2 with 1 upside in the 4th round. So you just don't need to spend an early draft pick. Also, another thing to consider is the fact that the rookie class for this year for fantasy is rated as the best wide receiver rookie class ever. And these rookies, there's going to be several of these rookies which are going to come out, and they are going to be immediate impact players. I've already told you about some of my favorites. I like Ruggs. I do think Jefferson's going to be very good. I kind of want to stay away from Lamb and from Judy just because they're in a crowded wide receiver situation. So I think their opportunities will be limited. But there's other guys farther down the list, like Mims, I think is a good one. Who's another one? I'm drawing a blank on it right now, but there's other options. There's other options that are available later that you'll be able to get as well. Guys that are going to have startable potential for fantasy year one. So again, like I said, don't spend an early pick on a wide receiver. All right, tip number 4. Okay, this is a new one, man. Be cautious with older quarterbacks. Now, last year, we saw a couple of older quarterbacks show their age, right? You had Eli Manning, who lost his starting job and then retired. You also had Phil Rivers, who, again, prior to last season was a rock solid low-end QB1 for his whole career. What happens last year? His touchdowns plunge, his interceptions skyrocket, and everybody has been blaming it on a poor offensive line. And while I'm sure that probably has maybe something to do with it, with quarterbacks, man, they when they hit the wall, it's a fast and sudden decline. And I'm afraid that that's what happened with Phil Rivers this past year. We have been blessed in the NFL with quarterback longevity. Most notably, you got Tom Brady and Drew Brees, who are playing way past their expiration dates and still doing very well. Although even Tom Brady was showing some signs of decline last year. But when it comes to quarterbacks, man, historically, they usually only make it into about their mid-30s. About 36, 37 is when they hit that wall. And Eli Manning hit it, and I feel that Phil Rivers has hit it. And also, I'm looking, man, Ben Roethlisberger, I think he has hit the wall too. I mean, yes, he had a season-ending injury last year to his elbow and his throwing arm, which is a bad enough injury as is. But if you look at his performance before that happened, it was awful. I mean, it was just like he was terrible. And I just have a feeling that he has hit the wall as well. And so best case scenario for someone like Rivers or Roethlisberger is they become a competent game manager that can keep the turnovers down and just do just short, safe throws, and get away with it that way. Kind of like what Peyton Manning did in the year that he won the Super Bowl. He was clearly in the decline stage. He clearly hit the wall and was rapidly declining, but he was able to adjust his game plan, just do the shorter throws. He wasn't chucking it deep, and he was very careful about not causing any turnovers. And lo and behold, they rode that defense to the championship, and they won. They won the Super Bowl. So anyway, I am downgrading. Not only am I downgrading Roethlisberger and Rivers, but I'm also downgrading the team. Any players on those teams, unless I can get them late. Unless I can get them, maybe 9th round or later. Those are the kind of players that I would, I would just steer clear. I think Pittsburgh is right on the cusp of being a complete offensive rebuild. They're going to have to just start from scratch. They're going to have to draft a quarterback next year. I hear Juju's going to leave. Connor has not been reliable enough. I think it's going to be a house cleaning. So just be aware of that. And like I said, you don't want to bet your fantasy team on something like this. It's just a really, really big risk. And if Roethlisberger has hit that wall, man, you're not going to want to own any Steelers because it's going to be a low volume passing offense, very safe, very conservative. There might be some rushing yards available there. I actually do like Benny Snell as an option, but anyway. For the most part, you just want to stay away from these guys unless you get someone cheap late. So my final tip is, and this one I talk about every year, man, and I'm going to start out with a list. I'm going to see if you can figure it out. All right. So what do the following players have in common? Le'Veon Bell, Mark Ingram, Tevin Coleman, Jared Cook, Latavius Murray, Dante Moncrief, Jamison Crowder, Terrell Williams, and Antonio Brown. Oh, and Deshaun Jackson. Oh, and John Brown. Okay, so what do all those players have in common? Well, they all switched teams before the 2019 season, and really, for the most part, they all sucked. Ingram had a good year, and Brown had a good year, but no one else did. And I got to tell you, man, I see this every single year. Every single year, there's a big group of players that have switched teams, and all of them suck except for one or two. Every year. and people just keep saying, oh, what a great situation they're in. Oh, I can't wait. This is going to be this a new dawn for this player. And it's so, he's going to get a fresh start, right? A fresh start. No. It's an adjustment period. These guys have to get used to new coaches, a new coaching system, a new offensive playbook, new players. I mean, he's got to build trust with his receivers and his running backs. Who can he rely on? This is all a process, and at best, these guys will start to emerge about mid-season. But you don't want that, man. You don't want slow starts. You need a fast start in fantasy. You want to get yourself out early with a winning record, because you don't want to try to be clawing yourself back up the not the draft board, but back up the league, because you lost 2 of your first 3 games, right? You need a fast start. These guys are terrible options for fantasy. Now for this year, all right, they've already been on the team for a full season. So now they're established. So now these players, there's lots of them that I do like. Le'Veon Bell I like. Jamison Crowder I like. I think John Brown is probably pretty good as well. Now they're established. But let's look at the list for this year. And there's a lot of big names, man. Of course, the big one, Tom Brady. You got Gronkowski, Melvin Gordon, Austin Hooper, Jordan Howard, Emmanuel Sanders, Robbie Anderson, Eric Ebron. Like I said, one of these guys is going to be great. I don't know who it is, and you don't either. So I would just steer clear of any player that changed teams in the offseason. It's just not worth the risk. It's a sucker's bet. You think I could definitely pick out who's going to win, who's going to be the best one of this group. It's going to be Melvin Gordon, but it's not. It's probably not. So those are my 5 tips for fantasy this year. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and leave a comment. Let me know what you think about these tips, and if you have any tips that you use for fantasy football this year that you'd like to let me know about. I'd love to hear it. So thank you very much for watching. Have yourself a great rest of your week, and I will talk to you again on Saturday. Have a good one, everybody.